So if I could introduce Professor Sunstein. He's currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard, and from 2009 to 2012 he was Administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and was very influential in that role, and quite a lot has happened since then, and as a direct consequence of his activities in that position. He's founder and director of the program on behavioural economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. He's been actively involved in congressional debates and committees on a whole range of subjects, and been involved in constitution making and law reform activities, both in the United States and in other countries. He's author of many articles and books, as you all know, because I'm sure you'll have read some of them. I suppose most relevant to today and our focus on regulation is his book on nudge, or two books on nudging, and nudging's become quite a thing here in Australia, and he's written very eloquently on the values and virtues of that kind of approach compared to more orthodox prescriptive regulatory approaches and so on. His most recent book, one of his books was called Simpler, The Future of Government, and that too has been influential and overlaps with his other work. And so it's my pleasure to welcome you, Professor, to this audience in Canberra who are here eager to hear what you have to say. And I'm just going to keep my fingers crossed now and hope that all goes well. And it's evening, I think, where you are. It's morning over here. So over to you, Professor Cass Sunstein. And could I ask everybody to welcome him in the usual way?
Thank you so much, and good morning, I guess is the right word. You all look as if you've gotten terrific night's sleep. It looks like it's mid-afternoon in terms of energy level. So what I'm going to talk about is based on my experience in the Obama administration. And to give you a little perspective, in 2009, when the president came in, the American economy was in a difficult position. And a central goal was to try to make sure what we did on the regulatory side, whether it involved environmental protection or immigration or healthcare or financial reform, was compatible with the economic recovery. And one set of ideas that had to do with the theme of compatibility was to try to simplify government. And I think this needs to be underlined because it's a theme from which nations all over the world maybe could do a lot in the next 10 or 20 years, including the United States. One of our simplification exercises, which I'll say a bit about today, is called the Regulatory Lookback, which is an effort to look over and scrutinize the rules on the books and to eliminate or simplify them if that was possible. A second simplification exercise was to try to reduce paperwork and reporting burdens on the public. And I think this sounds a little dry and technical, but it's actually really important because paperwork and reporting burdens can often sap small companies, small businesses, and individuals. A lot more attention needs to be given to that. A third idea was to try to emphasize clarity and plainness of meaning, to make sure that things are transparent to people. And that is very important also because sometimes the regulatory system is both less effective than it should be and less efficient than it should be because there's incomplete understanding of what is happening. A fourth theme involving simplification has to do with international coordination and harmonization. The world is, as a lot of people have attended to, is increasingly interdependent. And for nations to have disparate regulatory practices often just creates friction among systems and compromises economic growth, can have adverse effects on employment and standard of living. And to have more in the way of international harmonization often just takes kind of close work among people. Okay, now for some details. More slides than this first one. We have a little constitution in the United States for regulation. It has the charming name 13563. Who could forget that? And it has a set of provisions. The first, and in some ways foremost, says that agencies have to do cost-benefit analysis before they proceed with expensive rules. That means they have to show that the benefits justify the costs and that they've chosen the approach that maximizes net benefits. And this seems really dry and technical, but it's a really important way, I think, of ensuring that regulations are increasing rather than decreasing social welfare, of ensuring that interest groups and dogmas and anecdotes don't hijack the regulatory system. So it ensures a kind of technocratic discipline. The second idea has to do with flexibility. And here, this is from the President Obama, says that agencies have to find approaches that maintain flexibility and freedom of choice for the public. So you can see this as a way of counseling agencies to try to use warnings, information, and default rules. I'll say a bit more about that, rather than mandates and bans. The third idea is public participation. And here the emphasis is on the fact that the public often knows things that the regulators don't. And if there's an effort to seek the views of the people who are likely to be affected, government decisions will be better informed. So public participation here isn't about anything abstract or highfalutin. It's not about legitimacy with a capital L, though that's important. It's about something more pragmatic and mundane, which is about avoiding mistakes. And time and again, my own experience was that engagement with the public can reduce errors. A fourth idea has to do with integration and coordination. And here the goal is to make sure that overlapping, redundant, and inconsistent regulations are harmonized as a way of simplifying the regulatory state. And the last idea I've referred to, I'll say a bit more about that, is the regulatory look back. If you get anything out of these remarks, I hope it's these 5 principles, which have helped guide the work of the United States government over the last years. And in a way, they're as much aspiration as reality. The hope is that they'll continue to improve our regulatory system as the years go by. Okay, here's a chart on hard numbers. Under the Obama administration, through 3 fiscal years, the net benefits of rules have been $91 billion. That's more than 25 times the net benefits under the Bush administration, which is not meant to be a criticism of President Bush, who also delivered billions of dollars in benefits. It's meant more to be a tribute to the work of people in a very hard economic time to make sure that the benefits are significant and the costs are low when the government is proceeding against the private sector. That's an abstraction, that $91 billion figure. Here's a way of making it more concrete. The last bullet on this slide, billions of dollars in economic savings for businesses. So one thing that hasn't been widely publicized is that the Obama administration has actually eliminated regulatory burdens, taking away huge costs that have been compiled over Republican and Democratic administrations. They also include billions of dollars in savings for consumers, as, for example, through fuel economy and energy efficiency rules, which make sure that it's less expensive. Sorry, someone's calling me. I think it's my wife calling me, but we're going to get that. We're going to silence that phone right now. That billions of dollars in savings of consumers for reducing costs from appliances and automobiles. And there are also thousands of lives saved and tens of thousands of illnesses and accidents prevented from things like food safety rules and air pollution rules and rules involving traffic safety. In fact, the number of lives lost on the highways in 2011 was the lowest number in recorded history, and that's a tribute to cost-sensitive regulatory requirements. Okay, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs was created under President Reagan in 1981, and the basic idea is that it has a lot of substantive authority over what the regulatory state does. So the institution that Reagan was determined to have would be able to say no to the rest of the government. So the president, of course, ultimately has the decision, but under the Reagan framework, if there's a rule from the Environmental Protection Agency or even the State Department that's subject to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, it can say no. And that authority is extremely important because it helps to ensure that the system is well managed, that there's some coordination of the regulatory state, that information is received from lots of people, not just one agency, and that costs and benefits are taken into account. So a big goal that President Reagan had was to have kind of sound management with reference to costs and benefits, and to get that, he created some veto power. This institution has proved robust. It has persisted across Democratic as well as Republican administrations, and the major recent emphasis has been on the regulatory lookback, as I've mentioned. I think I want to underline on this slide the idea of the Paperwork Reduction Act, because that doesn't get the blood flowing so much, but its importance on the ground is really important in terms of making sure that entrepreneurs and individuals who are trying to get their businesses going and their lives, in order, aren't faced with burdens from the government. Okay, here are 3 concepts for you that may be helpful for orientation. The most straightforward is the last, simpler. If we can make our governments work in a way that's easy and intuitive, it can make a large difference to people's lives. Taking the middle billet second, all of our choices have an architecture behind them, choice architecture. So when we visit a website or go into a government office or read a regulation, there's actually an architecture to it. And what we end up doing often depends on what the choice architecture is. For example, if we sign a form at the beginning rather than at the end, we're more likely to be honest. Pretty surprising finding. If a candy bar or food is in a green wrapper, people who care about health are more likely to buy it, even if it's completely unhealthy and full of high calories. The nudge idea is that it's good to have policies that influence people's choices, but let people go in the direction that they see fit. So I'll say a little bit more about that, but the big idea is that sometimes you can have a small change that preserves freedom of choice, but that has a big impact on what people ultimately do. Okay, what is a nudge? A GPS is certainly a nudge. That big elephant is nudging the little elephant, and I like to think that the little elephant, if he wants to go into that bush, he can. But the elephant is the big one's trying to say, stay on the road. Please don't go into that bush. Okay, here's my only scandalous slide. The men in the room will recognize this. Yes, this is indeed a urinal. The women in the room, if you haven't seen one before, here's your chance. That's what a urinal looks like. And what makes this a urinal of some interest and not merely scandalous is there's a fly painted on the urinal. And the painting of the fly on the urinal, it's not a real fly, has reduced spillage in the Netherlands airport by over 40%. Apparently, men can't help but aim at the fly once it's there, and it's had a big impact. In addition to being a modest public safety, health, cleanliness initiative, I think there's a real lesson here that people pay attention to things if there's some kind of signal that gets them to, and they otherwise don't. Here's a study from a large hospital in the United States intended to get people to eat healthy. The idea is 2 little initiatives can have a big impact. One, if you color the healthy foods green and color the unhealthy foods red, meaning you have a little tag that signals whether they're healthy or unhealthy, you can significantly increase people's consumption of healthy foods and significantly decrease their consumption of unhealthy food. You can also have a big impact, actually roughly equivalent impact, if you make the healthy foods more visible and the unhealthy foods a little less so. Now notice that these are nudges because they completely preserve freedom of choice. People get to choose whatever they want. The only innovation is to make it easier for people to find the things that are healthy. I think there's a large lesson there as well. Okay, the definition of a nudge is a feature of the social environment that affects people's choices without imposing coercion or any kind of material incentive. So disclosure of information, like about calories, warnings, smaller portion sizes, default rules, and drawing attention to social norms, those are all nudges. People often say, I'll have what she's having. Their human behavior often is herd-like. And if we draw attention to what most people are doing, that can have a big impact on choices. I'll say a bit more about that in a bit. Okay, do nudges work? If there's any slide you remember on regulation, I hope it's this one. It's not a constitution, but it's some pretty good data. In Denmark, automatic enrollment in savings plans has had a much bigger effect than significant tax incentives. Now, as a longtime University of Chicago person, I stumble every time I say that sentence because it's not supposed to be true. Significant tax incentives should have a big impact, automatic enrollment not so much, but the opposite is so. If you automatically enroll people in a savings plan, a big effect. Significant tax incentives, less so. And in the United Kingdom and the United States, we found automatic enrollment is also having a massive effect. Now, different countries have different approaches to the pension issue. So what's important about this is not so much the particular domain, but the great importance of the default rule. If you want to save some paper, have a default rule that says double-sided printing. That turns out to have a bigger impact than a lot of other ways to try to save paper. There's a law in the United States on credit card use, which has nudges and disclosure in it. It's saving consumers over $20 billion annually. And a chunk of that comes from things that aren't mandates. There's a company called O-Power, which has a home energy report, which tells people how much energy they're using compared to their neighbors. That has an effect on energy that's equivalent to an 8 to 20% spike in the cost of energy. Not a likely result that a short report that shows social comparison would have the same effect as a big price increase. Simplification of our financial aid form for education, simplification of the form has the same effect as a several $1,000 increase in the subsidy. So there's an opportunity there in an economically difficult time, which is simplification often has the same effect as a significant increase in economic incentives. Okay, here's a slogan for you, plate not pyramid. What you're seeing is what was at one point one of the most visited websites in the entire US government. In fact, it got attention all over the world as a guide to healthy eating. There's a person, gender unclear, no shoes, walking to the top of a pyramid. It's not clear what the top is, whether it's death or thinness or purgatory. There are stripes of various colors you can see. It's not clear what they signify. And there are foods bunched together. They're not really recognizable as foods. If you look at the bottom right, there is something that looks recognizable. It looks like a shoe, doesn't it? But I don't think the government is telling you you're supposed to eat a shoe. Okay, we got rid of this and replaced it with the new USDA food plate, which says make your plate half fruits and vegetables. Now, if you look at the difference between the two, one is confusing and ambiguous, and the other is simple and straightforward. And the slogan, plate not pyramid, signals the fact that when people don't respond to a regulatory instruction, it's often not because they hate it, it's because they don't understand it. So resistance is often a response to ambiguity. Okay, simplification is a nudge. We know that complexity, as in the pyramid, can have serious adverse effects, defeating program goals. So two of the last things I did in the government were to call on all agencies to simplify their requirements, especially on small businesses and participants in federal programs. One thing there's a lot of data on that's emerging is that when people who are poor and struggling don't take advantage of programs that private and public institutions offer them, it's because take-up is burdensome. And if you can simplify take-up, you can often make a big difference in people's lives. We also tried to simplify forms by saying before the government imposes a form on people, it has to test it to make sure that they can actually understand it. These are very straightforward ideas, but the hope is they can have a big impact. And we already know that the United States government has eliminated over 100 million annual hours in paperwork burdens. Time is money, but this often involves access to things that really make a difference in people's lives. Okay, I mentioned social norms operate as nudges. So people's use of energy decreases significantly when people learn that they're spending more money than their neighbors. Increases in the use of seatbelts has been prompted in part by changing social norms. Two problems that many nations face are distracted driving and childhood obesity. And the way into solving those problems involves paying close attention to norms. We know if people get a sense that there's an emerging change in behavior, so that talking on your cell phone while driving is a little like not buckling your seatbelts, or if overeating is a little like smoking in circumstances in which other people are annoyed, then we could have a big impact on behavior. Okay, here's a website that was created that tries to make real the idea of public participation. It's called Regulationsgov, not maybe the most exciting name, but the basic idea is that the government needs to obtain the information that people in society have. And incidentally, this is used by people all over the world, not just in the United States, to provide comments on proposed regulations. And my biggest surprise in government was to see that the process of getting comments from people who would be affected by regulation or who just have a view on it, it actually really matters. So academics think, and I confess I thought before I went into government, that the process of seeking public comment is a little like kabuki theater. It's not real, but it turns out to be extremely real if you have officials who are committed to it, in the sense that regulations get changed, improved, and sometimes even stopped because people make comments that signal the wrong direction was being chosen. Now, this is not, I should emphasize, a point about interest groups and political pressure. That, in this regulations.gov process, is unimportant. It's a point instead about obtaining information about proposed courses of action. So if you have a rule that will affect, let's say, people in Australia or people in Brazil that the government hasn't adequately taken account of, and the government learns that the effects will be serious, then the regulation maybe can be fixed so it doesn't have those effects. Okay, the regulatory look back. This executive order, 13563, we need a mnemonic device to remember that, and it's impossible to think of one, so a 13-year-old, a 56-year-old, and a 3-year-old. This requires agencies to submit plans periodically to review their rules to determine whether they should be modified, streamlined, expanded, or repealed. And my hope is in the next 10, 15 years, we're going to see this simple idea built on in the United States to get more continuing scrutiny of existing practices, and something like this to be used all over the world. We see it in the United Kingdom. There have been significant developments in this direction, and there's no reason that nations shouldn't be institutionalizing this basic idea. Now, in the early period, over 24 agencies, which is to say all the executive agencies in the United States government, released reform plans with nearly 600 initiatives. The release was preceded by public comment, and just recently, actually, the government has gone out for more public comment on what they can do to simplify. Billions of dollars are being saved in the near future. Some of those billions have already been saved. One example is the Department of Health and Human Services kind of quietly eliminated unnecessary requirements on hospitals, nurses, and doctors with anticipated 5-year savings in excess of $5 billion. As I mentioned, over 100 million hours of paperwork burdens are going or are gone. Okay, future directions. Greater simplification and ease. The regulators need to take this really seriously, in part because it increases program effectiveness. Second idea is we need to ramp up our empirical assessment of human consequences. There's a movie some of you may have seen called Moneyball. It's about baseball starring Brad Pitt. And the idea is to use statistical analysis rather than experience or anecdote. And I think that's a real lesson for regulators. Experience and anecdote are pretty good if you don't have anything else, but compared to empirical assessments, they're quite primitive. And the goal for regulators ought to be really disciplined about the empirics. Randomized controlled trials are in medicine the gold standard. You don't do before and after measures of the effectiveness of an asthma drug. You have a randomized trial. And increasingly, we should see regulators doing exactly the same thing. We need retrospective analysis, the Lookback, to be routinized, to be a standard part of the regulatory framework. And last point, which I heard from the business community, maybe more than anything else, is to pay attention to the cumulative burdens of regulatory interventions. The cumulative burdens can, incidentally, for businesses that do work across international boundaries, they can be just the cumulative burdens of having to worry about Australia and New Zealand and the United States and Germany, which can exert a big toll on economic growth. Okay, so we are at the tip of an iceberg with respect to regulatory reform. We can see the top, and it's pretty good looking, but if you see the whole thing, it's beautiful. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation, and I think we will retain a few things, if not the number of that regulatory order. So there's an opportunity now to ask Cass some questions. It's customary down here in Australia, Cass, I don't know whether it's the same in North America, for the chair to have the prerogative of the first question.
Great.
And one that I might ask you is that a problem we've had in Australia is that we devise all of these new approaches and processes for scrutiny of regulation and review of regulation, but often they're really observed really through lip service rather than in a meaningful way. And entrenching arrangements that are actually upheld and substantively upheld has been quite a challenge for us. And related to that, I guess, has been the difficulty of maintaining this sort of rigour or scrutiny over time. There are waves of enthusiasm and reform, and then things sort of drop back, partly reflecting, I think, the inherent culture within bureaucracies and regulators. Would you care to comment on that in relation to the United States and perhaps any measures that have been taken there?
Sure. Well, there's no country that's perfect, certainly not our own regulatory practices. But to the extent that things have gone better than they otherwise would, it's because President Reagan made a decision in 1981, which is there is an office, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, that has veto power, subject to the president's override. But that means if the agencies, choose your one, aren't doing the analysis with sufficient rigor, aren't complying with the paper requirements, the job of this particular office is to say, no, the rule can't go forward. And that happens a lot. Sometimes it's controversial, but it happens a lot in the sense that the rule will be stuck in the process or will never come out because there hasn't been compliance with the requirement. I should say that the number of people who are enforcing the requirements extends well beyond the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. So other people get to see the rules, including the Council of Economic Advisors, the National Economic Council, and they may say there hasn't been compliance, even if the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs is relatively passive. So the big point is, for the paper requirements to mean something, there needs to be an institution with authority to enforce them. And Reagan's decision to create that has proved robust across Democratic and Republican administrations. And I know President Obama's commitment to cost-benefit analysis was central to the practices over the last years, and certainly has mattered in the last couple. So paper doesn't mean much necessarily without someone having the authority to turn it into steel.
Okay, we have similar institutions in Australia, sort of regulatory gatekeeping institutions and so on, but my understanding, but Rex might correct me later, is that they generally don't have veto power. They can describe as inadequate a regulation impact statement or something, but there are ways of getting around that, and those loopholes have tended to be used here. So we might pay a bit more attention to the design, institutional design in the USA, which seems to be biting more significantly. Are there other questions or comments in the room? There should be a roving mic. It is early in the morning, I know, and
we're going to use behavioral economics techniques to get you to ask questions if you don't start.
Okay, there's one over here. Please give your name and where you're from, please.
Yeah, George Brennan from the ANU. I had a similar sort of question. I was interested in what might have prevented that office from just being abolished by the next president as from the opposing side. I mean, you're quite right, we don't have that sort of institutional authority here, and it's hard to imagine secretaries actually allowing it, given a choice. Most secretaries like to keep a free hand. But I wonder why politically it was maintained, because so often when there's a change of administration, it's like, oh, well, that was their idea.
Yeah, well, I think a couple things happened. Under President Clinton, there was some hope on the part of, let's say, the political left, that the office would be rendered very weak because it does have cost control as one of its main missions. President Clinton, I think, made his decision to maintain it was motivated by two concerns. One is just his desire to have regulatory balance rather than, to have the secretaries doing what might be, completely well motivated but not have a broader perspective. So it was to have a cost control. And the other idea was to make sure that the government was coordinated under him. And if you have an office that is not a, independent actor, but is under the president and also has a coordinating function to make sure the government's working together, that will appeal to any president. And I know President Obama had a number of goals. One is to make sure that cost-benefit discipline is maintained, and another is to ensure that there's sensible coordination. So if one of his departments wants to do something, that's not a sufficient reason for it to be done. That certainly matters and deserves respectful attention, but it may be that one of his department wants to do something, but other parts of the government, and maybe the president himself, aren't sure it's a good idea. And that needs to be thought through. So even with an administration that has a different political affiliation from the one that created the office, in this case, a Republican creator, Democrats find it very important.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Yes, John Alford. You just might have to wait for a microphone, John.
John Alford, Professor of Public Management at ANZSOG. I presume you would have come across the notion of responsive regulation and the work on that, which has captured the imagination of many regulatory agencies in the Australian context. It seems to me that nudge adds something powerful to that notion, and that there is some degree of fit which together would add up to something very powerful. Can you comment on the relationship between the nudge idea and the responsive regulation idea?
Yes, I did know that work well, but I don't have it kind of at the tip of the head. So I think I'll answer by saying what's distinctive, if there is anything distinctive about the nudge approach. What it tries to isolate is possible interventions that completely preserve freedom of choice, but that have a big impact on actual outcomes. So one idea is, instead of mandating something, why not just switch the default so that people end up in the place that it's probably good for them to be in, unless they say no. Default rules are all around us. They're on your cell phone, they're on your tablet, they're on your computer, and they tend to be very sticky. The government often sets out default rules or changes them, but isn't so self-conscious about their impact. So the idea is, if you have the equivalent of a GPS, a guide, you can often have a large effect on social outcomes, but you allow people to go their own way. I think that isn't the idea of responsive regulation. For better or for worse, the idea of responsive regulation, I think, is much more general than that.
Okay, we have time for one more question. If there was, yes, towards the back.
Hi, Tanya Smith from consulting firm Nous Group. My question is about the behaviour of regulators that are at the arm's length from government, and the extent to which you can persuade them to employ the sort of principles that you've been talking about. So here in Australia, we've had a lot of emphasis on having principles-based legislation that's written in plain English, and then there might be subsidiary legislation which tries to uphold those same principles, but then the actual power of regulation goes to an independent regulator who then interprets those rules into very kind of complex forms, and it's at that level that the burden is really felt on the part of the regulators. So I'm wondering what advice you have for how you can influence the behaviour of those more independent regulatory authorities.
Okay, it's a great question, and I'll talk around it a little bit. We also have, in the United States, both the cabinet agencies, which are not independent, they're subject to the government, the president, and then the independent agencies like the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Communications Commission, which have a different legal status. And I think it's probably parallel to what you're discussing. When the President of the United States endorses a particular approach to regulation, even if he doesn't require the independent agencies to do that, it puts a lot of pressure on them. So the Executive Order 13563, which you saw, even if you don't remember the number, that one actually had a big impact on the independent agencies and continues to, because it states best practices from the President. And if an independent agency disregards them, either in its practice or in its theory, it has some explaining to do. And that we've seen something going on in the direction of those principles as a result of presidential authority. So you have your own parallels, high-level people who are respected. There are two other ideas. One is, if there's judicial involvement, the courts can press the independent agencies in certain directions. So we've had courts that have been pretty enthusiastic about cost-benefit analysis, and they've had effects on our independent agencies. And if you have pressure from the legislature, the parliament, that can also, of course, have an impact. So the fact that members of our legislature have been enthusiastic about some of the ideas in 13563, Republicans as well as Democrats, that's exerted some influence, at least on some independent regulators.
Good. I think we've run out of time for questions, but I think, Cass, it's been a really helpful session in the sense that you've provided some insights into the approach that's being used in the USA, but also an indication of the savings involved. And the savings are potentially quite large, and I'm assuming in the US, as here, they're savings that aren't compromising the policy intent of the regulations. And I guess that's the point, to reduce those unnecessary costs. And this is an ongoing challenge that both of our countries have, and I can say from OECD experience that we're not on our own either. It's a universal challenge. So could I ask everybody to thank Professor Cass Sunstein for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Many thanks to you.